Quite a few different seemingly random circumstances inspired me to record this video or put in my mind the notion to make such a video. One of them being that YouTube, apparently at random, suggested to me a response to my channel, I think from a couple years ago, from another small YouTuber who was one of the chorus of young men who bitterly denounced me for suggesting that he ought to quit video games. I don't mean him in particular. I mean that all of us would be better off, would be living better lives if we really look seriously at how many hours and how many minutes we're spending on things like playing video games. And if you've been to this channel before, you know this is connected to my critique of, my questioning of what is the meaning of life, what it means to lead a meaningful life, etc. And I have definite answers, but I think the most significant part of those discussions is that I lead my audience in reflecting on those questions, on formulating those questions and applying them to their own lives. Even if you come to a completely different set of answers from mine, just the process of asking yourself the question seriously is going to lead to changes in your life. It really is. And whether it leads to you completely quitting video games or resolving to only play video games for 1 or 2 hours a week or something, I think any and every notion of a meaningful life is going to be incompatible with playing video games as a habit and numerous other habits and distractions as well. The question of what you're being distracted from is indeed a good one in settling into this conversation. Anyway, seemingly at random, while I was at the gym this evening, YouTube recommended this video to me. And I just say, if you do book reviews on YouTube, often, not always, often, the best time to do a book review is when you're halfway through the book. By the time you get to the end of the book, do 2 videos, even do 3, make multiple videos while you're reading the book, and you won't regret it, because the things you were thinking about and worried about and wanting to talk about on camera when you were halfway through the book, you won't have them in mind anymore when you get to the end of the book, when you're finished. And if you record at the end of the book, often you'll have an exasperated feeling. Anyway, so I was listening to this video and I hit pause. I don't even think I was halfway through. So this is a similar kind of response. He said something that I think is, as it sparks this video, it's worth speaking to, even if it's kind of completely inaccurate and unfair and wrong. He characterizes my position as follows. He says, well, you know, Mazard claims that playing video games is a waste of time. And what does he contrast to playing video games? Research. Now, this is a misrepresentation of my argument, but I still think it's worth answering. Like, I don't just simply say there are 2 paths in front of you in life. One is video games and one is research. I think that a meaningful life and the meaning of life involves a lot of learning for us, and learning involves research. So research is part of the answer, but this isn't some simple question where I say, instead of video games, do research. That's the way he characterized my audience. That's the way he characterizes my position in contrast to his own, and fair enough. And then the next plank of his argument is to say, well, research could be more meaningful than playing video games, but it could not be. And his choice of example is fascinating to me. He says, let's say, for example, you are a white English-speaking American living in the United States of America, and you do research on the history of the border conflict between China and India. Now, I would assume, this video is not new. I'd assume he mentioned that example because at that time, I'd made videos talking about this. I have made some videos talking about the history involved. And he goes on to say, well, this research would be totally meaningless to your life. It would be not rewarding for you at all. This is just mind-blowing to me. And the problem is that this guy is so young. He's so inexperienced that he has no idea what he's talking about. He has no idea how meaningful and rewarding it would be for him, especially because he is a white American who has no connection to the history of China and no connection to the history of India to do research about the history of the China-India border conflict. And he cannot imagine how, so I don't know, let's say he's 19 or 20 years old. Between age 20 and age 30, that research he might do in 3 months, how it doesn't just become meaningful for a short time in his life, but it remains meaningful. And it comes up again and again and again between the age of 20 and the age of 30, between the age of 30 and the age of 40, his whole life long. Like, this is my point. I'm not faulting him saying that he's like incorrect or made a misjudgment of something. I'm saying that very often when you're talking to young people, you're talking to people who have never done any research on any subject whatsoever and have then never lived with those findings, lived with the outcomes of that research, lived with the results of that research in such a way that they understand how it enriches everything in their life, right? Now, I'll give a quick contrast to this, and I'll come back to the same example. Many angles from this. And by the way, welcome to everyone in the audience, and I'm happy to chit-chat with you guys and reply to you guys also. I know that many people who are my regular viewers today are people who think a lot about this and think about how they can lead a meaningful life and how they can grow intellectually, ethically, and so on. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed that incredibly few people in the audience actually want to make a difference in the world politically. That's my disappointment. My audience is not radical enough to suit me. But I do have a lot of genuine intellectual dissonance in my audience, and I appreciate the hell of it. I have a lot of people with good intentions in that respect. However, when it comes to actually changing the world, I don't yet have the warehouse of talent I might be hoping for in that respect. Okay, Melissa and I had a conversation a few days ago with another young man, and he is 25. Yeah. And he was saying to me, and I can relate to his situation very well. He's at a world famous university in Germany. And he was saying to me that he actually finds it embarrassing that when he's just standing around having conversations with people in Germany, his level of knowledge about history and politics, the result of the research he's done over the last 10 years, it results in people just being kind of astonished at him and saying, how do you know all this stuff? Why are you so educated? And people saying things that are incredibly flattering in praising him. Now, I point out, this is a very particular situation. So I was in the situation at the University of Toronto, supposedly the best university in Canada. I was in the situation at the University of Cambridge, the University of Oxford. Like I've been on the campuses of elite universities. I was not a student at Cambridge or Oxford. I was just giving lectures at these places. I was chit-chatting with people and so on. Hobnobbing, you might say. But you're at a situation where everyone on that campus is at a certain level of erudition, but they're aware of the level of erudition that's expected of them, and they're aware that they don't have it. And then they meet someone who really exceeds their expectations of other students, maybe also their expectations of the professors, right? And there's this real kind of wow effect. Wow, and it is pathetic, but they just don't expect it. They don't expect to meet, again, 25 is not young. It's really not. They don't expect to meet a 25-year-old man who has a sophisticated, nuanced perspective on the history of the Vietnam War. I'm just giving random examples. Has a sophisticated, nuanced perspective on Napoleon Bonaparte, and that period of French European history. Whatever the example be. Just someone who has really read and studied and learned things about a whole bunch of different chapters of political science and history. And this particular guy, he also knows a lot about the hard sciences, which are not the examples I'm using. He's also very well educated, for example, about the theory of evolution and the history of sciences. Connected to that. So this is a guy who, I'm aware I've influenced him tremendously in the last 5 years. To some extent, he's living by his own philosophy, and to some extent, he's living by mine, and to some extent, there's an overlap between the two. But he is one of the people who's really taken a sense of direction and motivation from this YouTube channel and from conversations with me and so on. I'm aware of this. This is not an independent case study. I've also been through a lot of those same kinds of situations. I've had people telling me I'm a genius and being amazed by me and stuff. And I'm a critic of, put it this way, that's a picture that's almost entirely produced by the frame. You know what I mean? People kind of start with this framing and then fill in the blanks. Like, okay, I understand you perceive me as a genius because like this is the situation, this is the scenario that creates this expectation and this perception. And anyway, it is what it is. And you could look at even the same example, 25-year-old guy at a major university in Germany, and you could say, look, you should expect everybody to be like this guy. Like everybody at this age on this campus, you should be disappointed with all the other people and reviling them as idiots. You should be insulting and upbraiding the other students because all they do is spend their time playing video games, going to nightclubs. In Germany, by the way, prostitution is legal. So they have a very high rate of young men going to sleep with prostitutes while they're in university. Many countries it's illegal and they do it, but really in Germany, you have men and women, but young men and women in university living dissolute, self-indulgent lives and making incredibly little intellectual process and just doing the study that's required to pass the test to get their degree, and so on. Now, in the conversation that we had just a couple days ago, I said many things to him, but one of the things I emphasized to him again and again was, sorry, I should just finish that part of the anecdote. He said that he feels that he's not a genius. He feels that he's not extraordinarily intelligent. He feels that he's not intrinsically or innately superior to these other people. He feels that what he knows and what he's able to say for himself is just the result of the work he did over the last 10 years. That you do 10 years of reading and 10 years of research, even if it's kind of at random. Oh, I'm interested in Napoleon. I'm interested in the Vietnam War. Even if you're just picking these things up piece by piece and you start connecting the pieces and learning from them. And he also, I forget to what extent this is the result of my YouTube channel, but he's also now done some reading from ancient Greece and Rome. I forget to what extent I influenced him in that, or he might have had that in his first or whatever, but certainly my YouTube channel encouraged him. So you start reading some Aristotle and some Thucydides and this kind of thing and putting these things together, before you know it, it adds up to much more than the sum of its parts. You start making shrewd analytical judgments, contrasting one thing to another. But anyway, he said that he doesn't feel like he's a genius. He just feels that this is the result of how he has been living his life for the last 10 years. This is what I said to him. I said, yes, but you cannot imagine how much more rewarding it is in the next 10 years. That's what you have no idea about. Like these people you're talking about, they can't imagine how they'd feel if they were in your shoes, if they had done, like if they're also 25, if they had done in the last 10 years what you've done. They can't imagine that. But like you can't imagine where I'm at. You can't imagine how rewarding this research is, the outcomes of this research. And you never forget it. It never leaves you. You carry it with you for the rest of your life in this tremendously powerful, tremendously meaningful way. I'm going to make a little bit of a digression here. It's not too much of a digression. I did not play any video games today. But if I did, yesterday or the day before, I played a video game for the original 8-bit Famicom. But so if I sat down and played that game again today, I can shout out the Famicom game I played. I remember I played a game. Melissa was boiling water. You were making soup or something in the kitchen. And partly to amuse her and to pass like 5 minutes, I started playing this 8-bit video game. And it was so I played one level of that game. So I don't even know if that was 5 minutes. Just being real, it could have been 3 minutes, but one level of an 8-bit Famicom. And I chit-chatted. While I was doing it, I was chit-chatting with Melissa. She was back here boiling water and stuff. That's no big deal, okay? There is no way I could stretch that to just 1 hour of playing video games. There are so many books in this apartment I really want to read. Now, part of this, all you guys can relate to, even if you're watching this at 18 years old or 16 years old, you know what it's like to have a book you want to read. Okay. There are books in this apartment I really want to read that I've already read before. Okay. And that's harder to relate to. That when you get to 40 years old, going back and reading Aristotle again, it's different now because of all the other research you've done, all the other things you've learned, all the other things that have been connected to it. And like, dude, I think I could read Aristotle's Politics again today. And I think I could read it again 5 years from now. And sorry, I'm not going to get into all the stuff I've been reading and, why that's so meaningful and why that's so rewarding. But like, I'm not saying this to insult anyone. I'm saying for real, whether you are 18 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, or 40 years old, depending on how much experience you have with research, this means nonfiction. This doesn't mean reading novels, doesn't mean reading comic books. Sorry, but like, you really can't imagine the way in which it makes your life more rewarding and more meaningful every day. The way it makes my life more meaningful while I am in the shower, like not thinking about anything in particular. The way it makes my life more meaningful and rewarding when I'm sitting and looking out the window. And the way in which I'm positively motivated, like if I am going to play a video game for 5 minutes, while I'm playing that video game for just those 5 minutes, my mind is wandering, and it's not wandering to like, oh, big-breasted women or something. It's not wandering to. It's not wandering to, oh, I wish I owned a fancy red sports car. No, like I am really thinking about research I want to do and things connected to research I've done in the past. There's a world of like material there, of thoughts and ideas and passions and concerns that I actively want to expand and work on, basically all the time. There are only so many hours in the day when you're really alert, when you're really focused. But I mean, that's the greatest tragedy about something like video games. Video games are what you do. You have to be alert and focused. You don't play video games while you sleep. It either reduces the number of hours you're sleeping, or it reduces the number of hours you're doing something else meaningful, like research and so on and so forth. Okay, great comment from plant-based powered in the audience. Quote, "You're obsessed with talking about video games. You want to play video games." So I don't think this is a big digression here, But so I've said this in different contexts in different ways. I can talk about it in a kind of sad and demoralized way, and I can talk about it in a kind of joyful way. All right. Video games cannot make me happy the way they made me happy as a small child. Now, I have a daughter. I haven't seen her for years, but I mean, okay, I can give two great examples with my daughter. I remember my daughter just seeing a cat. It's not worth telling the whole story. She saw a cat through a window, and the cat yawned. So that when a cat yawns, it shows off its teeth, and it might have been her first time ever seeing that. Like, she was so little, she was so young. And she was just so delighted and so overwhelmed by this. And she kicked her little feet and was smiling up. She was so happy just to see a cat or a kitten, whatever it was, and see it yawning, and she's so overwhelmed by this. Okay. I can never feel that way again. There are all kinds of things that are overwhelming when you're a child. And, I do remember what it was like to play a Sega Master System game when I was a child. I remember also the sense of excitement in opening one or purchasing one, like the acquisition of the video game is something separate. Okay. There is just no way video games can ever do that for me anymore. And if you regret that, what are you really saying? You want to regress to a childlike level of simplicity? Is that really what you want to do? And if I could sell you a drug that would let you regress, like when you're high on this drug, when you're under the influence of this drug, you're so simple-minded that you can enjoy playing video games that way again as a child, or you can enjoy staring at a cat while it yawns the way a small child does. I think for a very short period of time, some really intense mind-altering drugs have that kind of effect on people. They reduce you to a childlike state of mental dysfunction. It can't last long, and you build up tolerance, and bad things ensue. Would you want that? Would you want to regress to a childlike enjoyment? But look, sorry, I don't think you're new to my channel, Plant-Based Power, but I have made many, many videos talking about video games. I do not trivialize the impact they've had on my life, and I do not trivialize the impact they've had on other people's lives. I once did an interview with someone who was here on YouTube, and he said, well, why do you talk about video games this way, as opposed to, his example was adult coloring books, other hobbies people have that take up time. And it was cut very short, that part. He immediately changed the topic. I said, okay, tell me, do you know anyone who dropped out of university because they were addicted to adult coloring books? And sort of right away, I was like, yeah, well, let me shift the topic. Anyway, but look, video games had a huge impact on my life. I don't know anyone for whom coloring books or assembling puzzles out of puzzle pieces had a huge impact on their life. Of course, video games are not the only thing. Of course, some people get addicted to gambling, like with a deck of cards, But for my generation and for the generations younger than me, video game addiction and video game playing are at epidemic levels. So I'm just going to give a link to a video. If you guys don't know my back catalog of this, my whole point is not to trivialize this. That's a video titled "Quitting Video Games: The problem is profound, not just a waste of time." And it's taking it seriously. So that's my whole approach. So look, someone else in the audience says, so again, the point here is not that video games are the only problem in the world. They are an a tremendously important problem. So someone else in the audience called Rewi says, quote, to be honest, he's had the same issues with porn. And he says, ultimately it comes down to use of time and energy. So I'll just say this to Rewi directly, but to anyone else down, it feels that way. So, I can't relate to that because I can't imagine watching pornography for 2 hours. Like 2 hours? Really? Like, and I believe, I think there are real statistics on the internet to back this up. I think for like the vast majority of men, if there's something that interests me that I'm going to look up in terms of porn, it's going to be 5 minutes. It's going to be a very short, fleeting interest. And, I mean, I do watch the news. I watch all kinds of things on the news. And you guys know from my YouTube channel, I follow certain kinds of controversies within YouTube news, so to speak. That I analyze and comment on my YouTube channel. Every so often, it's mentioned that someone has started doing pornography, like someone who was a YouTuber or someone who's some person. And I think, oh, okay, I wonder what kind of thing they're doing, and I look it up to give you an example. Never once have I felt fascinated and then watched their pornography for even 1 hour, let alone 2 hours. And with video games, we're talking about 40 hours, 30. We're talking about hundreds of hours going into this, right? Most of the time, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And sometimes also, like, the news is misrepresenting it. Like, the news says that this person is doing porn, but you look it up and they're really just posing in a bikini. Like, it's not really porn. And sometimes the news says somebody's doing porn. You look it up and you're like, yeah, that's hardcore porn. Like, so sometimes it's just kind of, and sometimes you look at it and think, wow, that person is much less attractive than I thought they were. And sometimes the opposite. But no, so I'm just saying, Ray, I understand where you're coming from, but I think I'm in the majority where I'm just not susceptible to that being a significant loss of time in my life. And now, by contrast, my relationships with women, all of them, real women, not pornography, real women, the number of hours I pour into talking to, caring for, building a relationship with the women in my life, the women I have sex with, the people, it's an enormous number of hours, a huge amount of time. And so breaking up with any of them, like that side of my life, the relationship side and the commitment side and the breakup side, that's a huge, huge investment of many, many hours. So again, I'm not making some kind of qualitative comparison here, just a quantitative one. So it doesn't make sense for me to offer that kind of analysis of porn. So Rewi says that yes, he did have the experience of porn being 1 hour to 3 hours a day for many years of his life. Okay, so it's interesting to hear, but there's got to be some other YouTube channel that addresses that. For me, I can't relate to that at all. And the other thing I'd ask is, I don't know, were you listening to the news while you looked at porn? Like, for me, like, even though I'm someone with a very high sex drive and I'm very interested in sex, I'm interested in people, I'm interested in having meaningful relationships with women, like, if I'm listening to a podcast about the history of Napoleon while looking through porn or something, that's kind of one thing. But like, this obviously relates to my overall intellectual character, but I absolutely can't imagine it being interesting. So look, hey, a legitimate open question: do some people drop out of university because of porn? I'm guessing in a country the size of the United States, there were a few. Like, I don't know if there are 5 guys a year or something. How many people ruin their university education because of porn addiction? Maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there might be a couple. However, the reality with video games, this is at epidemic levels of millions and millions of people. So that's why we talk so much about video games. But I do also talk about love and romance. I talk about all kinds of other things in life, meaningful and meaningless. So it's not. Now, unfortunately, it looks like that guy, plant-based powered, I think he just thought he'd insult me and then leave the audience. Well, it's too bad. Where'd you go, man? I guess he can dish it out, but he can't take it. At this point. All right. So look, I was making this point to this 25-year-old friend of mine who's at a university in Germany, where, for him, it's good news. For him, this isn't like a caution or a reproach or an insult. I'm saying, well, look, you can't imagine how much better it gets. You can't imagine how much more rewarding the life of the mind gets. Like, you can't imagine how wonderful it is to wake up in the morning and be me And, for him too, like I just say, like 10 years from now, the result of this level of, one of the most fundamental things is developing your own curiosity, honing your sense of curiosity, sharpening your sense of doubt, having this kind of analytical, doubting mind where you doubt the things around you all the time. You actually investigate them and do research and come to conclusions. So I'm saying to him positively, you can't imagine how much better this gets when you have another 10 years, behind you. Okay, now shifting focus to this other young man, I don't know, I think he's about 20 years old, who was defending playing video games by suggesting that this kind of research, doing research about the history of the border conflict between India and China, would be totally meaningless and not rewarding for a white American, unlike playing video games, right? In his case, I have to say the same thing, but it's with a bit more of a harsh tone of condemnation, where what I have to say to him is, you have no idea how rewarding it would be for you, yes, you, to get off your ass, get off the couch, and really research the history of the China-India border conflict. You don't know, and you don't even have something else you've researched that you could compare it to. And you are really speaking as a fatuous, blithering idiot. If you can even imagine that playing Pac-Man for 40 hours or playing World of Warcraft for 40 hours could ever be as rewarding for you, short-term or long-term, as studying the example you chose, not an example I chose, if you really hit the books and study the history of the China-India border conflict. Now, I want to say, I do understand his sense of estrangement from it, but he doesn't understand, especially when you're young. This video is advice for young men, and some of it's already, a lot of this is male-centric. This is not a gender-equal video. This is really talking about young men, not young women. Okay, especially as a young man, you don't know how important the issue of detachment is. So yeah, it may seem to you like India is a far-off, estranged place. You don't really know any of the political leaders. You don't have any kind of emotional attachment to them, any kind of bias. But as a young man, especially, you don't realize what an advantage that is. So let's just this is a digression that is not in any way a digression. This is a digression that directly contributes to this conversation. If I sit down and talk to a young man about Mohandas Gandhi, this is the political leader often referred to as Mahatma Gandhi, right? Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi. Now, so if you talk to a 20-year-old man, a white American man, he either knows nothing about Gandhi or he has seen some short clips of a fictional movie about him on TV, like maybe during a news segment, some kind of aesthetic awareness that this is a very skinny, wise man wrapped in a robe. Like, he has an image of Gandhi that's not really connected to any kind of political knowledge, but he's pretty detached, but probably some preconception that this is some kind of holy man, as even calling him Mahatma indicates, rather than using his actual first name, Mohandas. But if I'm talking to someone who's grown up in Arkansas or grown up in Detroit or anything else, and you say to them, "Oh yeah, I know this is your perspective on Gandhi and Indian history that you may have just gotten by passively watching American television or some of this. You've probably never even watched a movie that was about Gandhi. We've seen some kind of images this way. He wasn't an expert in religion. He didn't really know anything about Hinduism, Buddhism, or the philosophy of ancient India. He didn't study languages like Sanskrit or Pali. Really? Well, he wore a robe. You know what I mean? Like, he kind of dressed that way. Yeah. At the very end of his life, do you know how his career actually began and how he became a powerful person politically? No, it was in Africa. Really, Africa. Okay. Now, here's my point. If I'm talking to someone born and raised in India, whether they are Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, whether they are high caste or outcast, like whether they're rich or poor across the social spectrum, you are probably dealing with someone who begins with a deeply ingrained bias. They are really attached to one view of Gandhi or another. And it's very difficult to have this conversation. Now, his career should be in Africa. Africa, not India. Oh, In Africa, he was a lawyer who became famous arguing that brown-skinned people, people of Indian ancestry, not black people, not Africans, that people from India who were living in Africa ought to have the right to fight in the British Army alongside the white soldiers, to fight for England, not against England. That was how he got famous. Okay. So curious? You want to do some research? Want to challenge some preconceptions? See, you think you can tell me that where this leads to, this rabbit hole, if you go down this rabbit hole, if you start doing this research, you think that's irrelevant to your life in Kansas, in Arkansas, in Detroit, in Washington, in the United States of America today? I think if you do this research, it's going to become meaningful and it's going to remain meaningful in your life. And it's going to come up again and again and again. It's going to be connected to things you read, things you talk about. And it does come up. When I was involved in vegan activism, came up all the time. And my critique of direct action everywhere, they may go back to talking about Gandhi, but I criticized what they were saying about Gandhi and they dropped it. So that was a critique that reached Wayne Seong, the leader of Direct Action Everywhere at that time. Since then, the leadership has changed. So they may go back to talking about Gandhi. But I've actually impacted other vegans who was like, look, all you guys are claiming, to be disciples of Gandhi. Have you read even one book about Gandhi? Well, here are some facts, So it comes up in all kinds of things. It enriches my understanding of all kinds of things in history. But at its most basic, fundamental, simple level, you're already learning there the way perceptions and assumptions in 21st century politics can be based on a kind of cartoon image of someone. It's a skinny man wrapped in a robe. So you have all these assumptions about what kind of education he has, like what his area of expertise is, what things he can be trusted on. You have assumptions about him being kind of aloof from politics, right? Like as if you rise up, well, that's not Gandhi. Right. And now, so right away, now you're thrust into a situation where you realize that the propaganda is radically incompatible with reality. Who Gandhi was, what he knew, and what he didn't know. Start looking into his sex life. There's another shock coming for you there, guys. He was not living in celibacy when he was wearing that robe. Let me tell you. Okay. So, but if you do this research now, some people are going to watch this. They're 16 years old, 18 years old, 20 years old. I'm telling you, you do this research. This is easier for you to visualize than if I talk about something abstract like the border between China and India, because we're talking about a person. But if you do the research about the border between China and India, it also involves people. It's no big surprise. They're going to be similar discoveries, similar, shocking recognitions and revelations that come and go, right? But at this very simple level, you learn to question the difference between appearances and reality, assumptions and the results of real research. You begin to cultivate a kind of detachment that you can and will apply to your own culture, your own history, your own political milieu. I think I do not need to digress to add that you will never gain any of these things from video games. You will never gain any of these things from going to a nightclub. You will never gain any of these things from sleeping with prostitutes. Now, I think there's also a real question of what you do gain from sleeping with prostitutes, actually. I mean, it's kind of, there are complex questions to be asked there. It would be very strange to claim you learn nothing from sleeping with prostitutes. You may learn a great deal that you can't learn from books, and I have to concede that point. But, what we're talking about, this is a book that used to be famous and is now forgotten, about JFK. Got JFK on the back over there. Okay. Now, especially if I'm talking to someone around 20 years old, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay. You don't think you have an emotional attachment to JFK, but you do. Right. To a much greater extent than you have assumptions built up about Mohandas Gandhi, based on short little clips on the news, little images in magazines, and over-the-top claims made by political leaders. Indeed, as mentioned, even vegan political leaders invoke the name of Gandhi. Well, people do that with JFK a lot. Okay, are you willing to hear Are you willing to hear the other side of JFK? Are you willing to hear some shocking facts about who JFK was politically and personally, that would show you the reality of who this guy was is as different from your assumptions as, the image of Gandhi as this pious, celibate, wise religious leader is that different. Are you willing? Are you really willing? Now, it happens occasionally, but a couple weeks ago, I had someone writing in and asking basically how he can develop as an intellectual. And it may seem like strange advice, but I said, well, look, and this guy had written to me at some length, and he seemed stupid and crazy. I'm just being, but to be clear, he seemed stupid and crazy, but he also seemed like someone who was highly motivated to really become an intellectual. He seemed like someone who really had passion and really wanted to grow intellectually. So that's good, but the stupid and crazy thing is a little bit dissuasive when you receive those kinds of messages. And so some of you already know this, but one of the things I encouraged him to do, I said, well, look, why don't you study the political history of Haiti? So the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and then the aftermath, where basically the French try to snuff out the Haitian Revolution to simplify a little bit. And I am not saying this because this is relevant to his life. In the same way that we've been talking about India, I was suggesting this, and I said this explicitly in the writing. I said, I think you should start by studying something you're totally detached from, where you have no emotional attachment whatsoever. You have no preconceptions whatsoever, where you're really learning starting from zero, right? But with each and every one of these things, right, you're really learning something profoundly important about human nature. And you're also learning the difference between propaganda and real history. You're learning all the ways people lie and deceive, the way they deceive people at that time and the way that we deceive each other in the writing of history. But if you're only 20 years old, you really haven't developed yourself intellectually, right? You won't be able to get very much out of this book. It's about how JFK was a terrible person. If you go and you study the history of Haiti, the history of the French Revolution, the history of ancient Greece, the history of ancient Rome, the history of India, kind of the debunking of Mohandas Gandhi as a political leader, and so on, and then you do it. It's going to be really meaningful for you and really rewarding for you, right? Because wherever you do research, what you're researching is human nature. It's like you're in a canoe in the middle of a great lake, and no matter where you put your paddle down, there's water. And no matter which way you decide is forward, one way or another, you have to choose somewhere to put that paddle down and start moving water. Just going to take a moment to glance at the comments. Okay, so here's a great question from Micah Wright. Welcome to the audience. I don't remember you, Micah. I think I would remember you just because your distinctive name. Micah asks, quote, how do you feel about studying scripture and building your understanding of something like the Bible? Whew, okay, so this is advice for young men. Now, I have a lot of experience dealing with this, including with my own current girlfriend and Emirata, Melissa here. Directly reading the Bible in English, the vast majority of young people will not know what they're looking at. They won't know how to analyze it. They won't see what's wrong with it. So when we went through biblical passages, Melissa and I, she had a brief period of being interested in educating herself this way, knowing what's in the Bible. And I would look at it and right away I'd say, oh yeah, but don't you recognize this is written by 4 different authors? Don't you notice here there's a break and then it repeats, and then you notice these inconsistencies. Like there's a kind of historical and analytical focus I have on the Bible. Of course, it's the result of years of on again, off again, looking at Bible scholarship. Like, oh yeah, but don't you notice here this contradicts this, and this is this is being misrepresented. I'm picking up on all this stuff. The vast majority of people, especially at say age 20, they can't do that with the Bible. And of course, the use of language and the way it's translated is part of it. But in large part, it's also just the nature of the text itself that it doesn't lend itself easily to that kind of analysis. Now, again, I think I can say with ancient Greece and Rome, probably or ancient Buddhism, if you've built yourself up through the study of ancient texts in some other field, you then might be able to come at the Bible. So look, the easy middle path to recommend is reading one of the truly atheistic, hard-hitting analysts and scholars of the Bible, like Richard Carrier. So you can listen to some of his. So Richard Carrier versus the historical Jesus. I am not going to endorse any particular book of his, but if you look up Richard Carrier, you will see he's devoted his life to this, and he's someone. I mean, it's one of those things. A lot of people they can't see the problems with the text, but once you explain to them, like once it's been seen, it can't be unseen. Once you start to learn to really be more demanding in reading the text, and why is it written this way? Why is it to look at it that way, then it becomes comprehensible to you. So I just mentioned an example that was given me by a Christian preacher was actually the use of the word "so" S-O-W in the Bible, and he was giving a lecture to college students, university. So these would be people 18, 19, 20 years old, something like that. And he stopped them. He challenged them. He read a very simple passage of the Bible, and he said, "What does the word 'so' mean here?" SOW. And none of them knew, and none of them had questioned it. So this is incredibly elementary. Like if you don't know what SOW means, this is not. We have a different noun in English. We have sow, spelled the same way. But where just your level of literacy is too limited to really take that on. So the Bible is, I mean, in some ways, it's an unusually frustrating text for young people to read. Now, look, I'm giving advice for people I presume are stupider than myself. We had a comment here earlier, which I assume was just meant as an insult, saying that, quote, "I think you perceive yourself as a genius." Well, look, if I were making this video only addressing young men, or a younger version of myself, it would be totally different. Okay. Because I mean, when I was a child, I was able to read the Bible and notice contradictions and problems in it that astonished my father, and I was right. I mean, like years later, I read scholarship that backed up what I discovered was correct, and I was just reading it and interrogating it in a genuinely skeptical and demanding way. And I think on a very basic level, looking at it as the work of human hands. Like, look, if this is written, it's written intentionally. And just comparing the four gospels, like, well, this gospel says this, and then you look at this other gospel, and it has been intentionally changed to instead say that. And my own father was very freaked out by that. But I was a child. I'd have to remember. I don't know if I was 11 years old or what. So I'm not saying this to insult you, but I'm not giving advice to people like myself. Now we can get into the disadvantages I had as a young man too. I didn't only have advantages, but I have had to learn. I mean, I would love to think people have this stuff in common with me, that they can read the Bible at age 11 the way I did. But I've learned it's not true. I mean, I've really seen it. And I've seen that partly from helping others and talking to others. Now, obviously I have this whole bizarre, much more difficult to relate to experience with Buddhist scholarship, and the way people just did not see what the text was directly saying to you because they didn't want to see it. As most of those people were middle-aged adults or elderly adults, that was not talking to young people because there were no young people reading ancient Buddhist texts. So that's another kind of problem. But I just say I'm being self-critical here. This is not a humble brag, but no, I'm actually not giving advice to young men who would be my equals in this respect. And look, I mean, and there are so many advantages and disadvantages that get rolled up into this. Um, including just the quality of your eyesight. You know what I mean? How well you can read. It comes down to some kind of absurdly simple things like this that differentiate one person from another. But, when I was with one of my ex-girlfriends from the past, I felt one of her disadvantages was just that she had incredibly low standards. She didn't look at the Bible and expect it to be brilliant and expect it to be well written. She didn't look at Karl Marx that way either. When I read Marx, I wonder if my mother still has the copy I read. But when I read Marx for the first time, I was going through and circling everything wrong with it. And I still stand by that decades later. I was finding things wrong with Marx, and I was right. There were real problems in Marx's Das Kapital. But, the point is, they're two very different books, Marx's Das Kapital and the Bible. But the point is, I'm looking at this, and this is supposed to be genius. Now, again, sorry, I can appeal to Melissa. She knows. When I watch Star Wars, I watch it that way. Like anything, when I watch Batman, like I'm watching with these really high expectations, and I'm looking at every word as being very intentionally placed in the text, which, it is. That's the way to read the Bible. That's the way to read Karl Marx. That's the way to watch Star Wars. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, even this video now, my choice of words is very deliberate and intentional. Even though this is completely unedited, I have no ability to change anything I've said. Still, No, really understanding art and artifice and the relationship of the author to the page and the page to the reader, and really, that these things are so simple they rarely get talked about. But sure, and then interrogating those texts with really high standards. That there are many advantages I had over other young men or young people, but yeah, this is one that kind of cascades through many other aspects of the learning experience.
But I say, I have noticed that when you talked about watching Star Wars, for example.
Yes.
Many people like to get swept up into a story, and
right.
That's what they enjoy about reading. That's what they enjoy about watching movies.
Right.
But that is something that I see. It's a different process going on.
Yes.
When you were analyzing something.
Yeah. Well, I think the disturbing thing is to reflect on what does it really mean to be swept up. So, so you're talking about the Bible as an example here. The Bible is an emotionally moving text. You can get swept up in reading the gospel. You can read all 4 gospels in one day. It's just not very long. But you can read one gospel a day. It really doesn't take very long to read. Okay, what does it mean to be swept up in reading the gospel? So, I can say this. The first time I read the gospels, I was emotionally moved. It had an emotional impact on me. It did. However, I noted, the first time I read it, I noticed the passage about the olive tree, where Jesus says, if a tree doesn't bear fruit out of season, you should just pray to God to destroy it, and God will blight it and smite it from the face of the earth. It's totally absurd. It's totally ridiculous. Yeah. Remember that? And I can ask people, do you remember that? Where Jesus walks past a tree and he curses it for not bearing fruit out of season, right? And you can look at that right away and you can say the text does not make sense. Now, the reason it doesn't make sense is it's because it's an allegory that is not translated. The real meaning is not literal. The whole gospel is not something that literally happened. None of it's intended to be recording of historical events. But the problem is, what the fuck is wrong with you if you read that text and you didn't notice that? That's the problem. Is you should be, every single one of these things, you should be catching on them. You should realize, you should be really holding this in. Every word has been placed there intentionally. You can't look at that as if, it's just happenstance. It just so happened that on his way to the temple one day, Jesus passed a tree and he wished he could take some fruit from it, but it was out of season. So he cursed the tree, and then they go to the temple. And then when he left the temple, the tree was blighted because God had destroyed it. Like God had destroyed this because he prayed for it. And Jesus says, yeah, you should do that. That's a really, anytime a tree pisses you off for being fruit, not bearing fruit out of season, you should just have God blow it up for you or destroy it. Well, the reason why it doesn't make any sense is because it's just something that happened. No. So, but this is my point. Now I could give examples from Karl Marx, but another one that's was obvious to me on first reading was the misattribution of the 10 Commandments in the story of Moses. And millions of people read the story of Moses every year, and they don't realize that the King James translation, the captions and the headings, they are lying about the 10 Commandments. But what are the 10 Commandments in that story? They'd be somewhat longer things out. But I read it the first time. I was like, I noticed that immediately on first reading. Oh yeah, but that's not the Ten Commandments. That's several pages later. Why is everyone quoting this as the Ten Commandments? Clearly, it's explicit in the text. A different passage is telling you the Ten Commandments.
Where was the
This is
nun to slap you with a ruler?
right. Yeah. Anyway, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Okay. So anyway, but my point is here, I'm actually not giving advice to people like me. I'm not giving advice for people who can be to that extent an autodidact, teach themselves totally. And probably those people, okay, I would have benefited from the advice, but I'm just saying I'm actually giving advice for people with the assumption that they don't have the advantages, I had. And look, there's danger involved, okay? There is danger. We got a great comment from the audience. Vegan Gains is streaming video games right now. Okay, guys. All right. We have 33 people in the audience. If you want to leave and go watch Richard play video games right now, Vegan Games. So if this conversation is less useful, go watch Vegan Gains play a simulation of shooting people in the head, again and again and again. Anyway, I'm sorry. I've lost the train of thought I had before that. A delightful distraction. Oh, right. This is what I was going to say. There is a risk. Okay. Let's say you're talking about a 16-year-old, and 16-year-olds are rational, right? But they're easily swayed. They're easily overwhelmed. They're easily brainwashed. If you hand a 16-year-old a copy of the Quran, what's going to happen? What if you hand 10,000 16-year-olds a copy of the Quran? And I remember even within Judaism, when I was growing up, you saw this happening in Toronto, some percentage of teenagers who were part of secular modern Jewish families would commit to like hyper-Orthodox, super fundamentalist Judaism because they were being handed these sacred texts. Like they listened to their parents to some extent, but at some point they decide, hey, this book knows better than you, mom and dad. And they become fundamentalists. They become extremists. People can read the Quran and it ruins their lives. Tons of examples. People can read the gospel and it ruins their lives. Even if it's just for 5 years or 10 years, right? You can get swept up in it. What does it mean to be swept up in it, right? And Karl Marx is the ultimate example. It's unbelievable to me how many people let the reading of Karl Marx ruin their lives. And Das Kapital at its core is a completely dry and boring thesis about economics. It's 101, it's high school level economics, but still that destroys people's lives. So again, I'm not really able to give advice to you here, like if you're a young man watching this, which the assumption that you're the same kind of young man I was, because I read all this stuff with these very high standards, the very strong sense of my own will and motivation, with a very strong sense that I was the equal to Karl Marx, and that I was the equal to the men who had written the Bible. Karl Marx is an author. I am an author. This is a book. That's it. There's nothing else. You know what I mean? There's no magic there. And, it says the Buddhist monks who wrote ancient Buddhist scriptures, they were men. I believe a few women. It's a good question. Were any women actually involved in writing the Pali Canon? Maybe. Probably it was all written down by men. But anyway, there are a few female voices recorded in the Pali Canon. There are a few spoken parts of women. There's a predominantly male profession. But just really seeing it in that radically egalitarian way, the equality of authors, as opposed to, regarding this as a hallowed and unquestionable authority, And by the way, if you read Karl Marx, a lot of it very directly in an emotionally transparent way reflects what was going on in his life. So if you guys haven't read Marx, you don't know this. That's probably the best part of his writing, is that you get a sense of what's going on in his life as a struggling intellectual and author. And, he's messing around trying to be a labor union organizer, but he can't really do it and stuff. You get a sense of when, with this period, he's living in France and then he's living in England and so on. I'm sorry, I forget if he actually lived in France. He spoke French fluently, but he moved from Germany to England. You just get that very human sense. But anyway, likewise, talk about Mohandas Gandhi or something. He was a guy, he became a lawyer, he went into politics. Looking at that fundamentally human and egalitarian way is a big shift in perspective. But I have to give advice for people And I know there's danger here, and a lot of people can't do what I did. And a lot of people, if they took the same risks that I did, their lives would be ruined by it. We have some people here who support the assassination of JFK. I'm not entirely surprised. Well, I hope I live long enough to see how the perception of JFK changes. Just responding to some miscellaneous comments here about it. But obviously there was this one film made by Oliver Stone that changed the way the whole world saw this. And anyway, but I hope I live long enough to see Oliver Stone's influence evaporate, because that film was its own kind of mythology. So anyway, Mateo thanks me and donates $10. Thanks, Mateo. This will be the most profitable day for my channel in the whole month. My channel generates a few dollars a day, but hey, it's better than playing video games. It's better than going skiing. It's better than a whole lot of other things. I don't know how much you get into this. Sat12 asks, quote, "What if you designed a philosophy video game?" Okay, so I kind of feel like it'd be a whole different video to get into the educational potential of video games. What I'll say is this: it's interesting to talk about hypothetically how educational video games could be, but it's really more important to talk about the total lack of educational value in the reality of what video games actually are. Now, beyond that, I know most people are very uncomfortable talking about this stuff, but the sexuality that's displayed in video games, just the depiction of women in skin tight, attire in a game like the Street Fighter series of games. This is a powerful erotic effect on young men. And, we can go back to my generation. We talk about Street Fighter 2. We can talk about Bare Knuckle, also known as Streets of Rage. Where really the number of pixels is so few. Like, this is an erotic drawing that's made up of just a few points of light on a screen. And you can look at games like Street Fighter 5. Now, my point is not that these are the most sexually salacious games. They're not. These are precisely the games that parents think are harmless. Well, this is erotic imagery that young men are looking at again and again and again. You're seeing over many hours, and you're seeing the same animations repeated thousands of times. And, I do have this very accurate memory going back into my childhood. I can remember very fleeting erotic images that I saw, as a boy that really had a big impact on me. So, do you want to talk about something that's hypothetical, or do you want to talk about something that's actual? Is it possible to design a video game that would help you learn a foreign language? Yes. Nobody's ever done it, and nobody's doing it. I know it may sound like a preposterous claim, but for decades, I've tried to find video games that would help me practice language. And, aside from the crudest type of memorization card game, I've bought some. I think I have one still on the hard drive of this computer. I've paid money for this kind of stuff. I searched for many different languages to see who was doing software. And I've spoken to software developers, and I've spoken to people in universities. And so, there's a real total failure to produce educational video games. Oh, we own the only language education games for the Nintendo 3DS, 2DS, DS library. Incredibly few. And I went through all of them. There's like French tutor and Chinese tutor. So, okay, there's a kind of footnote here if you want to talk about the educational potential of video games, but let's not let that footnote distract from the reality of what video games are in our lives. It just isn't a justification for something else. So we had some more questions asking me to talk further about Karl Marx. Guys, we did do videos on that in the past. Or I did. Sorry, I say we because Melissa was kind of involved spiritually, you might say, with those videos. But I remember I made a video talking about Marx, and okay, I got a playlist, so that solves that problem. Okay, there you go. You guys can sort it out. But yeah, the one about Napoleon III, that's a really good one. Yeah, you guys are gonna have to go through and figure it out. The French Revolution, not Hegel, created Marxism. Yeah, I think all that's pretty solid. You got a couple hours there. At any rate, more than 1 hour of me talking about Karl Marx. So as always, I have to invoke YouTuber's privilege here and show you that I've already made videos covering some of these topics. So I have a lot of comments coming here. I'm just trying to catch up before I return to the thread of what I'm saying. And I appreciate your comments, guys, but obviously I can't respond to all of it, and not all of it is directly selling to it. Okay, so here's a question from Javier. Javier asks, quote, do you think there is any value to understanding the chemistry of the brain while playing video games or any dopamine-related activities so as to be aware of what is happening? So, Javier, I'm going to try to relate this to the overarching topic of the video, but I think it's a genuinely interesting subject in itself. So I have a couple different books here. Oh, you guys remember I did a review of this, who did and who didn't kill Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so here's a book about JFK, and here's a book about the My Lai Massacre. Okay, My Lai Massacre, a famous event in the history of Vietnam. Okay, so let's say I have you and your twin brother sit down and read these two books with some kind of advanced MRI brain scanning activity directed at your head. Wait, doesn't matter if it's MRI. There are many different ways to scan brain activity. Okay, what's the conclusion we're going to come to about which book you should read, and how would we possibly come to that conclusion on the basis of the analysis of how much dopamine activity is in your brain, or how much activity is in various lobes of your brain? Right. So the two levels of analysis are incompatible. Right. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that they're scanning activity in the brain is a completely irrelevant or completely useless form of research. But, there are still a few publications on paper. I don't see them for sale anywhere anymore. But there are some publications that are just book reviews, where the whole magazine is just reviews of new books coming out. Again, I haven't seen them for sale for decades, but I've looked into it. Some of those still exist. What if you and I start a new magazine, Javier, where we just review books based on the dopamine levels and brain scans of the person while they're reading? You could publish that. You say, okay, here's this new book on the My Lai Massacre, and here are the chart readings. Chapter 6, his dopamine levels are. We're not going to be able to come to any conclusion about how rewarding this is or how well written it is or something. Like, we can't draw the conclusions we want to draw about this topic through brain scans. Now, again, I'm just going to briefly expand on this to apply it to the topic of this video, talking about giving advice to young men about how to be an intellectual, how to be a better person, how to lead a meaningful life, how to set yourself up to be in a position to be a better person when you get to be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. Because believe it or not, I'm not just interested in how good you look on Instagram next month or 6 months from now. Let's really think about, 100-year, time frame here. Let's really think about how you're going to live your life, how you're going to live and die. The long-term value of what you're doing with your brain and what you're doing with your life. If we look at all the different activities in terms of dopamine levels in your brain, in terms of what makes you happy or what makes you mentally active, I'm sure you could come to a conclusion based on brain scan. Oh, based on brain scan evidence, young men need to be engaged in downhill skiing, parachuting, skydiving, coral deep sea spearfishing. I remember I didn't meet this guy. I met a guy who had gone shark wrestling. I'd never heard of that before. So it's where you dive and you're wearing diving equipment and you actually wrestle a shark. So this is something people pay money to do. I can imagine that would be very exciting. I think it's not vegan. I've never heard about vegans protesting against shark wrestling. Okay, but like the judgments we're going to make can never be on that level. Now, so Javier, now I've spoken about this more broadly and talk about over a 10-year period or 20-year period, what conclusions we come to. Now, let's now talk about it very, very narrowly. What is the significance in your life if for 10 years, the main form of entertainment, let's say for 10 years, 3 hours a day, you watch someone getting shot in the head again and again and again? So I'm talking about first-person shooter games. But there are people who play those games like Call of Duty, this type of game, which is really simulating you holding a gun and shooting someone in the head again and again and again. And within 1 hour, like, you tell me how many shootings take place in these games. And that is the main form of entertainment. That is your literature. That is the poetry of your life. That is the Shakespeare of your life, is sitting and playing a game like Call of Duty or Rainbow Six, for 10 years. It doesn't matter what brain chart you show me about dopamine activity in the brain. Like, I'm completely conceding the point. You could have a test subject who lives that way for 10 years. They play video games this way. And you can do the brain scans, once a month. You take brain scans and you show, look, this doesn't do any brain damage, doesn't do him any harm. He has totally healthy brain function. Dopamine levels are good. Everything else. I completely concede that. I think I have no claim that video games cause brain damage, right? In plain English, the claim is that video games make you into an asshole. Like, that's the claim, and no matter how good a person you are after living your life that way for 10 years, and you show me an example. I think most of those guys are assholes. They're terrible people. But if you show me an example of someone who's a wonderful person despite playing video games this way for 10 years, 3 hours a day, every day for 10 years, let's say, which is not common, sadly, think about how much better a person they could have been if instead, for 3 hours a day, they were reading books like this one, nonfiction books, challenging themselves, learning. And then let's say they were even coming on the internet like this and talking to wonderful people like you about these books and what they've been learning. Let's just add a social dimension to it or something. We're never going to come to any of those conclusions through brain scans. So I really very fundamentally think that the brain scan approach to video games is going down the wrong path. It's the wrong kind of analysis. It's the wrong kind of critique. Now, babe, do you want to hand me your book on antidepressants? I'll just hold it up for a second. There you go. Okay, right here on the desk. We have a lot of desks. This relationship is rich in desks, not so rich in beds. So we have 3 beds. I don't know how many desks we have. and we have a lot of desk space. Okay, I'm going to challenge myself. I'm going to challenge you by just saying, the critique of antidepressants, the critique of prescription mind-altering drugs, to what extent are we even going down the wrong path in trying to criticize those in terms of brain chemistry and brain damage? Because you see, everyone ignores it. Everyone justifies it, right? So like, even if you have brain scans that show that video games cause some kind of damage, something like compared to cocaine, it's never going to be that significant. Well, we have brain scans showing that the harm cocaine does. Nobody quits cocaine. Nobody says, oh, well, having examined the evidence, having examined the MRI evidence of how much damage, they're going to quit cocaine. But even these drugs are much less entertaining than cocaine. I mean, Ritalin, okay, maybe not. Ritalin, people tell me Ritalin's pretty close to cocaine. But anyway, Zyprexa, Wellbutrin, Klonopin, whatever, any of these, or the whole body of SSRI drugs like Prozac. Okay, I have never heard of a prostitute, performing sex acts in order to have money so she can buy Prozac. It's not gratifying in the same way cocaine is. But, my point is, if we can't get people to quit cocaine or Prozac on the basis of that kind of hard evidence, what is the point going to be of engaging with video games that way? And look, with that kind of question and that kind of answer, I hope I'm wrong. Wouldn't it be so great if I were wrong? Wouldn't it be so wonderful if people just look at the charts, look at the facts, and say, oh, that's it. Gee, we should all quit taking SSRIs. We should all, And by the way, so let's bring this back to another major theme in this video. Do you think you could convince someone to be an atheist? Do you think you could convince someone to quit prayer through brain scans, through showing a scan of the brain? This is what happens in your brain while you're engaged in prayer. I don't think you could. I don't think anyone's going to jump on that. I don't think that's going to change the world. And, there have been so many brain scans done related to Buddhist meditation, and of course, people interpret this in this ridiculous way to try to justify and vindicate Buddhist meditation as a panacea, so on and so forth. This is a rare case where people are really talking amongst themselves in the audience. It's fine. It just gives me a lot to read through when I try to catch up with you. One person comments, dopamine book reviews is a nice sales pitch. Okay, babe, do you want to jump in and say anything? I mean, I'll take questions from the audience, but
I'm just stuck on the dopamine book.
So look, I did intend this to be a short video, and I'm happy to wrap it up at this point. All right. A big part of the role you have to play as an older and more experienced person is to tell younger, inexperienced people about what it is they can't imagine. And, in some cases, you're telling them, look, like if you join the army, it's going to be worse than you can possibly imagine in this, and this way. Like you can't imagine how bad it's going to be because your only experience is going to high school. Well, here are the ways in which it's worse than high school. And you haven't thought about this. So that. But sometimes you're telling younger people or more inexperienced people, these things are going to be better in a way you can't possibly imagine. Now, I have been saying through this whole video, and it's the topic of the video, that this is advice addressed to young men. You know what the tragedy is? I give the same advice to people who are 50 years old. You can be 50 years old and still at that first step of intellectual development. And the odds are The reason why you got to age 50 and never went through that other intellectual development is because you have been playing video games, you have been smoking marijuana, you have been drinking beer, you have been watching sports on television, whether that be basketball or football or baseball. You've been alive for 50 years. You've been doing something, but you haven't been learning. You haven't been challenging yourself. You haven't been growing in this way. So the advice I'd give to a young man of 20 is in many ways shockingly similar to a man of 50, but it's harder for him to accept. It's harder for him to reckon with. It's harder for him to take seriously. It's harder for him to look at what he's done with his life. And there's a kind of sunk cost fallacy there. Well, you put all this time into football. Can you admit to yourself that football was a waste of time? You put all this time into playing video games. Can you admit to yourself this was a waste of time? There's something else you're doing. And again, my friend have been referring to the 25-year-old in Germany. Whether or not it's jealousy, there are some people who are going to look at him and meet him and talk to him and feel like, oh, this is the person I could be. This is what I could be doing with my life. This is the kind of result of research and the life of the mind that I could have. And instead, whether they've been going to nightclubs or sleeping with prostitutes or playing video games, whatever they've been doing, it's not the life of the mind. There are many alternatives to life of the mind. Maybe they're doing downhill skiing. I mean, could be anything. But they haven't been cultivating themselves and pressing forward in this kind of meaningful, studious way. So this same encounter and this same kind of confrontation between the examined life and the unexamined life, it can happen at any age, at any stage of life. And, it's of course with great sadness if you have this reckoning at age 50 that you realize how many years you've got left, how much of your own intellectual potential you have squandered. And then you face the challenge of what can you do now? How far can you go? What progress can you make? And, do you have the humility? Because let me tell you something. I mean, I was already an old man when I started learning Chinese. Started on page 1, chapter 1 with Chinese. Wosha, doing the ABCs of Chinese as an old man. Do you have the humility to start all over again? I'm someone, it's both a strength and a weakness. But obviously, in many ways, I can appreciate the strength. I've been forced to start again on page 1, chapter 1 of several totally different fields of study, totally different areas of expertise, and totally different languages again and again and again. And a lot of guys at age 50, they would rather just keep on playing video games or keep on watching sports or remain within the one field in which they feel some sense of self-confidence and power. Whatever that is. Like they're a veteran, they're a vet. They know how to cut the balls off a dog. They feel like an expert when they're a vet. They don't feel like taking off the jacket and recognizing that they're probably balefully ignorant of everything else, politics, history, languages, what have you, that actually they're an embarrassingly ignorant, unsophisticated person under every other possible heading, except how to chop the balls off somebody's pet Cocker Spaniel, So, now with that having been said, if you're talking to a 50-year-old vet, they do still have some part of their life they can feel confident about. They have some area where they are accomplished. So that may make them more willing to face up to, embrace, encounter, challenge the unknown, to take on, whether it's the history of India, the history of Vietnam, the history of China, or, the history within the United States of America that may be very disturbing to them, re-examining who JFK really was, what our century. It may be that the sense of strength and power they have in one area of expertise, and maybe they've done some research, within being a vet or something, that will enable them to do it. And when you're talking to someone who's only 20 years old, again, really it's like 18 all the way up to like 23, frankly. When you're talking to younger people who don't have this kind of experience, if they haven't been extremely exceptional, self-confident, autodidactic intellectuals, with most young people, you're talking to someone who has no sense of power, no sense of strength, no sense of expertise anywhere. And that's why, they break down crying a lot. I mean, there's a lot of real suffering and sorrow in these intellectual encounters. There are people who obviously feel like they already know Karl Marx, and they're, let's say, a 20-year-old who already feels very confident that they're a Marxist, that they're a socialist, et cetera. And then you reveal to them that they don't know anything about Marx. A great example is what I said before about Gandhi. There are people who feel very strongly they know who Gandhi was, they know what his philosophy was, and for example, they might be a young person who's interested in yoga and they eat a vegan diet and they're an activist and they're interested in animal rights and global warming. This is their combined set of interests. And then you tell them some things that completely challenge, completely ruin the image of Mohandas Gandhi they had in their minds. And there's a kind of collapse. Someone, the 50-year-old vet, I keep saying vet, I don't mean veteran, I mean a veterinary scientist, a veterinary doctor. But the 50-year-old vet, he may at least have a source of confidence that he can retreat to. He may feel more able to challenge and change and discard, old assumptions. And when you are talking to younger people, very often you will see them completely emotionally collapse, even when it's something that isn't their religion. Like they aren't Hindu, they don't worship Mohandas Gandhi, they don't regard him as their own religious leader. But it's such an unexpected challenge for them to recognize that everything they know is wrong, even in an area like that, which their ego isn't directly connected to, that they break down crying, that they crumble, that it's a life-changing, shattering thing to recognize their own ignorance and realize how much work they have to do. Whether you're talking about Marxism, you're talking about the Bible, you're talking about Mohandas Gandhi. And I've certainly seen that. I've seen that. I could tell very specific stories, but even people who were at the end of their PhDs, people who had a PhD, or they were in the last year of their PhD studies, where I say something that really totally challenges their assumptions and worldview. And I'm not just being provocative. I really do know what I'm talking about. And they have to realize the extent to which they are, in fact, a beginner in the very field they thought themselves to be experts. You want to say something?
Do you mind if I just say it one
Go
thing?
ahead. It's a great time.
We were in Thailand together.
Oh, that's a good example. Go on, yeah. Yeah.
With a group of vegans, and there was an older gentleman who was talking about Buddhism. He had no idea that an expert of Buddhism.
Some of you might know this guy. He was a very big, muscular white guy. I would not say he was a bodybuilder. I don't know what sport he did, but he had a lot of muscle on him. He was a very physically imposing guy. He could do gardening for all I know. Like you can build up your arms. Like he didn't look like a bodybuilder. He was a big, imposing white guy living in Chiang Mai. He's a vegan activist, and he's married to a Thai woman. Yeah. Do you want to say more about it?
Yeah. It's just interesting for me to reflect on that.
That's one where you saw it. That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He didn't break down crying.
No. And he was about 50. He was more than 50 years old.
Yeah, I think he must have been over 50. He was at that point where I think that he could handle himself when somebody confronted him in a situation like this, whereas probably younger men.
Well, okay, I feel that he. So here's an off-topic. William McGeehan says Gandhi had a great name. That's why people revered him, and he shows some emojis to this joking. You're wrong, William. You're wrong. In India, the name Gandhi means greengrocer, means grocery store manager. It's a common name. Yeah, it's not. In case you know, George Washington. Think about what that name means. It becomes familiar and you forget, his ancestors would wash clothes for a living. But no, Gandhi, he did not get ahead because he had a catchy name. Unlike me, I get ahead on the basis of my name. If you Google Eisel Mazard, I'm the only guy with search results. If my name were John Smith, I'd be at a great disadvantage. I feel so. This encounter that happened in Thailand, this was this guy, and we'll set the stage a little bit. It was something like a monthly meeting of vegan activists, and these were white English-speaking vegan activists. There were Thai activists. There were different types of vegan activists, but these were white Western people living in Thailand who were involved in this kind of activism. So Melissa and I show up, and one of the strange things about the guy was he didn't know who I was. Other people did. It was revealed. They didn't make a big deal of it, but the younger people there, they all knew who I was. I'm famous within that sphere, but this white guy, he was completely accustomed to being the big, imposing, important presence and de facto leader of these meetings. I have no objection to that. But he was very, very accustomed to repeating the same kind of catchphrases, the same kind of thought-terminating cliches about Buddhism. and how Buddhism, supported veganism. And then he was sitting there, with someone like me in the room. And then what I recall is I came close to our modern ideal of Socratic method, which is not the actually historically true Socratic method. It's not what the real Socrates was historically, but the way we think of Socratic method. Where I would just say a few words. I mean, if you were really paying attention to my posture and tone of voice, you could tell I knew a lot more than I was letting on. Right, but how do you know that? Yeah, but have you actually read the ancient text you're quoting? Do you know where that comes from? Like really kind of short questions like this. And I feel that he basically responded by kind of shutting down. So shutting down means different things, but he didn't make eye contact with me. He kind of looked away and was kind of looking down. And he was kind of like, well, yeah, that's a good point, and kind of pressing on. He was kind of repeatedly, and I was leaning forward, and I'm completely saying, no, that's, I understand why you say that, but Buddhism is based on written ancient texts. So do you know what it is have you actually read that? Do you know what you're quoting? Anyway, Buddhism is a very strange religion that way, because the vast majority of Buddhists have never read the equivalent to the Bible. They don't know the text, And oh yeah, right. But if he make another grandiose claim about Buddhism. So yeah, right. But if that were true, then this would also be true, right? Have you noticed this? Do you know what language those texts were written? And eventually, he really was not willing to have the conversation. He was like, yeah, I was a scholar of Pali. Do you know what Pali is? That's the language.
Yeah,
I've written an article about that. Do you remember? And anyway, maybe I'm wrong. I often perceive other people as being larger than they are. I remember him being bigger than me, just physically. But if I'm wrong, it's just because I'm often generous in actually estimating other people's size. We were all sitting down, not standing up. But he seemed to take up more space at the table than myself. It could also just be that I was sitting in a more humble kind of posture at the table, because indeed I wasn't the host or something. I wasn't in charge of the meeting. But it seemed as if I was the smaller presence physically. But yeah, what I said, it was not just challenging his authority. It was really undermining his assumptions about what he knew and what he thought he knew, and how you would know it. And it was really demonstrating to him, look, you're talking about this as if you're preaching sort of familiar set of tenets and conclusions about veganism and Buddhism and animal rights. And he obviously had given exactly the same lecture again and again and again to both Thai people and white people. He was saying that. He said, well, this is what I tell other activists. He was indicating this is something he said again and again. And I was indicating to him, no, you are still at step one. You are actually, you're a false beginner, but you are actually just, so yeah, that was that kind of situation.
Right. As I recall, it was a kind of TED talk about how to spread veganism. Yeah.
He was talking about what he tells the activists he worked with. Yeah. And to his credit, he had married a Thai woman and he spoke some Thai. So it included anecdotes about how he tries to motivate those people. Anyway, this is
well, you might think that he would have nothing to gain from studying some other unrelated topic.
No, but that's exactly what he lacks. Yeah, right. Okay. Like, look, in German, we have these weird terms like Verfremdungseffekt. In English, if you say estrangement, it has a negative connotation. If you say detachment, nobody knows what you mean, including the Buddhist concept of detachment. But, that guy, what surprised me was that neither during the meeting nor after, he was not capable of learning from me. Like, he was not even capable of making eye contact with me and talking to me, saying, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to hear more, or I'd like to read your article. Because I told him I'd written an article on exactly that topic, the history of vegetarianism within Buddhism, the fact that the Buddha was not vegetarian, the Buddha did eat meat, etc. His whole worldview was totally false. He knew nothing about this. But he was not able to learn from me. He wasn't even able to
express curiosity.
No, that's right. He was incapable of curiosity. He was incapable of open-mindedness, so on and so forth. Now, whether you talk about that in terms of detachment or not, I do think, the type of curiosity, the type of detachment, you can build that up exactly by doing research on things you are estranged from. If you researched the history of the China-India border conflict, if you had been through that process of debunking Mahatma Gandhi, you had been through the process of debunking JFK, there can be a constellation of various mutually isolated, unrelated research processes where you get familiar with what it's like to be wrong yourself. Like, oh, wow, I viewed it this way. Now I realize I'm totally wrong. I realize now how this assumption, led to this set of assumptions. And even though the first assumption was half true, what that led to was a, totally false misconception. Like you've gotten used to criticizing yourself, kind of overcoming your own misconceptions, and you've gotten used to overcoming others. Like, so Melissa's been doing a research project on the history of Central Asia. But even if you look at the research you did about the history of Greece or something, like you may not realize how biased and wrong the first book you read on that topic was until you've read the third or the fourth book. Oh, now I realize the first book I read, it was totally misleading me. I mean, Socrates is a great example. Most people are burdened with this totally false notion of who Socrates was and why he matters historically. I could say the same about Aristotle, frankly. Most of these there's a kind of mythology, and people don't even realize that what they know is a myth. And they may have heard it from high school teachers, they may have heard it at university. And then at what point does that crack? And you realize, oh, wow, like the first book I read about this, or it might have just been a chapter of a book. It might have been one paragraph in a book. It might have been one paragraph in your high school history book. Now I realize that misled me. And by the way, for me personally, something like the French Revolution, it's like that again and again. Like the first several books and articles I read about the French Revolution, I can now realize the way in which they were wrong in themselves and the way in which they misled me, because it's partly me. Like I read that article and I take it in this direction, But yeah, no. I mean, this issue of doing research with all kinds of unrelated things where you have detachment. Yeah. And the way that then enables you when maybe something you really care about, and something that's really attached to your own identity, you think you have a kind of expertise about veganism and about the connection between vegetarianism and Buddhism and vegan activism and the Buddhist philosophy. You feel very confident about this, and then someone steps up and says, "Hey, you actually don't know what you're talking about. You're completely wrong." The way to prepare for that, the way to have some basis. It's not even necessarily doing research on Buddhism, but it's having that kind of research background where you've really built up, in this very particular sense, some depth of character. Yeah. And no, I think that's fair to say about that guy. He was a guy who was very used to being in charge and very used to going unquestioned. Probably just because of his size. And, let's be real too. I mean, it depends what kind of movement you're leading. With veganism also, most people just don't question the people who are in charge. They have you're trying to save animals.
Yeah.
It's not the same as questioning, does this guy really know how to operate a crane on a construction site? Like, does this guy really know how to build a brick wall? Do you really know what you're doing? But when you're just trying to motivate people to help save the animals or something, most people are not going to really question. Do you know do you really know what you're talking about? Right. But as you know, I have about 100 or 500 videos talking about exactly what the harm is. Exactly. And very often the advice vegans give, whether it's about nutrition or anything else, nutrition or Buddhism or anything else, it is profoundly wrong. Yeah. So I'll say something else. We're talking a lot about detachment here. We're talking about estrangement. It's so sad. I mean, I really can just use the simple word sad. It's so sad to me that people will make the right decision for someone else, but make the wrong decision for themselves again and again and again. People are inclined to be self-indulgent, but they're not indulgent of others. They're demanding of others and have high standards for others. So, hey, James, I could pick anyone in the audience. Hey, Mateo, I got news, Mateo. When your mother was pregnant with you, before you were born, there was an extra set of cells kept at the hospital. There was an embryo identical to your own at the hospital as part of this fertility treatment clinic. And they took that embryo and they implanted it in another woman. So there's an identical twin to you. There's a genetic duplicate of you, but it was just born yesterday. You got to come pick up the baby. You have to raise your own clone. You have to raise your own twin. You have to be a parent to someone who is genetically identical to you. who was born yesterday. Well, the best way to raise this child is to have them smoke marijuana, play video games, watch sports on TV. Like, what would you do for someone else? What is the good life you would want other people to lead? When you even have this little bit of detachment, what is the life you want other people to be leading? It's, strangely, the excuses you make for yourself don't come into it. You see what I'm saying? Like, oh, well, I want this child. Like, normally the way people would respond to that challenge is, I want this child to have all the advantages I didn't have. Like, you look back at your own childhood and you realize how many hours you lost playing video games. And you realize, well, I want to provide this child with a much better education, with a much better upbringing. I want to give them everything I lacked in this, presumably in this intellectual sense. You presumably are not going to focus on making this child as self-indulgent as humanly possible. Or, again, we had the question about brain scans. You're not going to try to give this child the highest dopamine levels possible. You're going to try to enable them to lead a meaningful life and to have all the advantages of what you've learned, through your own life, and you can meet people, and there are a lot of stupid people in the world. There are a lot of malicious people. You can meet people who would say no. They would instead encourage their child to play even more video games than they play themselves. Their clone, their identical twin. There are people who say, oh no, if they had this child, they'd help them enjoy life even more by sitting them down on the couch and saying, hey, look, I've already played these video games, but now you get to use my same video game. Like, you get to get stuck into, the same video games I enjoy, but you get to play them even more. Because when I grew up, my mom would only let me play after I'd finished my homework, but not you, kid, because I am you. I'm the older version of you. So I know how much you want to play these video games. I'm going to do your homework for you when you come home from school. You get to sit and play video games. You get to enjoy them. I'll do the homework. Don't worry about it. Because I know how much I was you once. So okay. So you meet someone like that. And then, you can have a further degree of estrangement. We say, okay, what about a police officer? What kind of person do you want to be a police officer, making life and death decisions over you? What about Joe Biden? What about George W. Bush? What kind of education, what kind of preparation do you want those people to have? And, the most terrifying thing in the world is to live in a society where the police are drug addicts, whether those police are addicted to cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, video games. Sorry, but it's true. Do you want a police officer? Do you want a governor? Do you want a dictator? Do you want a president? Do you want a prime minister who's living that unexamined life? And if not, who do you want to have power over you? Sometimes the power of life and death, making these terrible decisions. Oh, well, I want someone who's totally sober, highly intellectual, devoted to life of the mind, someone who has read Aristotle and Thucydides, and someone who, oh yeah, we talk about this a lot, learning the lessons of history. How are you going to fucking learn? So I hate people on the left of this. I hate left wingers of this. Oh yeah, I'm going to learn because I've seen an Instagram meme about the My Lai massacre. I've learned the lessons of history. I know what went wrong in the Vietnam War because I saw a meme about it on Instagram or on Facebook, and I gave it the thumbs up. I gave it the red heart. No, if you're going to learn the lessons of history, you have to actually learn the lessons of history. And that may include reading an article that criticizes this book and points out the ways in which it's wrong. By the way, it's not just reading one book. Or you might read this and then later you realize the ways in which this misled you, or you maybe realize the way in which your view of the world was wrong before you read this book, and years later you might realize the way in which you were wrong at the time when you had read this book. Like going through this process of challenging yourself and growing. Oh, that's the kind of person I'd want to be a police officer. That's the kind of person I'd want to be the president or the prime minister. Well, then what do you want to do with yourself? Because I hate to tell you this, Mateo, but if you go to the hospital, I lied to you. There is no newborn baby for you to raise. There is not a clone of you waiting at the hospital for you. You do not have a twin brother to raise. You don't, but what you've got is you. You've got this life. You've got this one person you can control and influence. And, there may be a small number of other people who love you enough or respect you enough that you can really influence them also, right? And then why not hold yourself to those high standards or higher? I saw, you guys saw this on my channel too. It's a really good video. I hope more people see it. but I have this video that has just a few brief clips of the police in Miami, Florida. It's called Believing in Your Dreams, Worse Than Islam. So if you watch that, there are just a few moments of the police in Miami. And I feel so much contempt for these police. And they should, I mean, we need to change a lot about policing in the United States of America. But, you know, the police are talking to this guy as if they're gangsters, not as if he's a gangster, as if they themselves, the police are trying to sound tough and intimidating and uneducated. They're trying to sound like they're high school dropouts. You know, it's so inappropriate. And I mean, I know people normally present this in terms of racism. It doesn't matter if the person you're talking to is black, and it doesn't matter if they're white. You know, don't call him boy. You know, call him sir. Or Mr. Stevenson or whatever his name is. You know what I mean? Like, don't call him boy. Don't, you know, it's so deeply inappropriate what they're doing. And it's in a position in that particular clip where they do have their hands on their guns. They are in the midst of using, you know, deadly force, you know, potentially deadly force, you know, to arrest someone. You know, it's so deeply inappropriate. So I watched that. I just watched a short clip of the police doing this in order to put together this video. So there have been other times, and I've watched large amounts of police footage. And by the way, I have seen footage of police being courteous and appropriate and holding themselves to a much higher standard of conduct. But like, when I look at that, I can't help but feel there is this higher standard I have to hold the police to, right? But how can I even feel that way? How can I even talk that way if there isn't a higher standard still to which I hold myself, right? And that's what we're dealing with as a society on a massive scale and on an intimate scale, is that people are indulgent of themselves. They're self-indulgent, but they're not indulgent of others. They're demanding of others, and they're not demanding themselves. Why? Because fundamentally, they regard other human beings in loco parentis. They look at other people as if those other people are going to take care of them. Oh, police officer, you're the grown-up, I'm the child, take care of me. Oh, doctor, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, you know, take care of me. Other people will do my thinking for me. Other people will be virtuous for me, so I don't have to be virtuous myself. And the adult perspective on the world is instead, no, homie, it's all on you. Nobody is going to be a grown-up for you. Nobody's going to be a grown-up instead of you, right? Like, nobody's going to act on your behalf. Nobody's going to think on your behalf. Nobody's going to solve global warming on your behalf. It's you. And if not you, then who? As soon as you start living that way, as soon as you start thinking that way, you know what? You can play video games for 5 minutes. You can play video games for 5 minutes. But let me tell you, if it's been half an hour, if it's just been 30, it's gnawing away at you, bro. It's gnawing away because you have better things to do. You have, and this is not guilt. This is not like Catholic guilt where you imagine there's an angel judging you or there's a God judging you. No. You have an awareness of, a direct feeling for your intellectual potential. You know what you could be doing with your brain positively and productively right now. You feel your potential, and you don't need someone else to criticize you. You know that you're squandering